Level 1, intelligence. Support this specialist. You don't enter this world through a mission. You enter it through an application, a government website, a long form. Background checks that go deeper than anything you've experienced before. Education, employment, travel history, finances, personal associations. Months pass before you hear anything. Then an email arrives. Interview. Polygraph. Security clearance process. By the time you're officially inside, you've already been evaluated more than most people ever will be. And still, you're at the lowest level. Your title might be Intelligence Support Specialist, Operations Assistant, or Data Technician depending on the agency. The name changes, the function doesn't. You handle information. Raw, unprocessed, often incomplete. You're not here to interpret it. You're here to make sure nothing is lost. A typical day doesn't look dramatic. You log into a classified system. You review incoming reports, signals intelligence, human source summaries, surveillance notes. You format them, tag them, route them to the right divisions. Accuracy matters more than speed, because once information enters the system incorrectly, it doesn't just disappear, it spreads, and correcting it later becomes harder. You're reviewing a report that looks routine, travel data from a mid-level suspect. One entry doesn't match previous patterns, a city that's never appeared before. It's probably nothing, but you flag it anyway. Hours later, that small inconsistency becomes part of a larger pattern someone else is building. At this level, your decisions are small, but they're not meaningless. You are the first checkpoint in a chain that depends on reliability. The pay is stable, but not exceptional. Government salary bands, often between $40,000 and $70,000, depending on agency and location. Benefits are strong, health insurance, retirement plans, job security, but none of that is why people stay. They stay because this is the entry point, the only way in. And if you want to move up, you need to prove something very specific. Not intelligence, not creativity, consistency. Can you handle sensitive material without error? Can you follow protocol even when it feels repetitive? Can you avoid cutting corners when no one is watching? Because someone is always reviewing your work. And trust is built quietly here. The risks at this level aren't physical. They're procedural. A mishandled file, a misclassified report, a security violation. Any of these can end your progression immediately. You don't get second chances easily in the system. So you learn discipline, you learn how information moves, you start to recognize patterns, not because it's your job yet, but because you see the same types of reports over and over again. Certain names come up repeatedly, certain regions generate more activity, certain behaviors trigger attention, and slowly, without being told, you begin to understand what matters. That's when the shift starts, because the people above you, the analysts, aren't just looking for information. They're looking for people who can think about it. And if you've proven you can handle the foundation, you become a candidate for the next level. But here's the reality most people don't realize. Moving up isn't automatic. Time alone doesn't promote you. You have to be recommended, evaluated, sometimes retrained, and always retested, because each level of this system gives you more than responsibility. It gives you influence, and influence is controlled carefully, so you wait. You work. You stay precise. And eventually, if everything aligns, you're no longer just moving information. You're asked to start understanding it. That's where level 2 begins, and that's where your role starts to change in ways you can't reverse. Level 2, Junior Intelligence Analyst. The shift is subtle at first. Your access changes before your title does. New systems, new briefings. More context around the reports you used to process without question. You're no longer just moving information forward. You're expected to look at it, to notice things, to ask quietly whether something fits or doesn't. As a junior intelligence analyst, your role sits between raw data and operational meaning. You don't control decisions yet, but you start shaping what others see. Your day begins differently now. Instead of routing reports, you're assigned a focus, maybe a region, a network, or a type of activity. You review multiple streams at once: communications intercepts, travel patterns, financial records, prior intelligence summaries. Individually, they still look fragmented, but now your job is to connect them, to build small pieces of a larger picture. You're comparing 2 weeks of intercepted communications. Nothing stands out at first. Then you notice a phrase repeated across different conversations, same wording, same timing. It's subtle, easy to ignore, but you flag it. Days later, that phrase becomes a marker used to track an entire network's activity. This is where pattern recognition becomes responsibility. At this level, mistakes don't just get filtered out, they start influencing direction. If you miss something, it may never be revisited. If you highlight something incorrectly, resources may be wasted chasing it. Your work feeds into senior analysts and targeting teams who rely on your accuracy. The pay increases typically between $60,000 and $90,000 depending on experience and agency. But the real change isn't financial, it's cognitive. You're now expected to think, to prioritize, to decide what matters before anyone tells you. Promotion to this level usually comes from internal recommendation. Supervisors review your consistency, your attention to detail, your ability to handle classified information without issue. Some agencies require additional training, analytical writing, intelligence methodologies, threat assessment frameworks. You're being prepared for something more than support. You're being prepared to influence. But influence comes with pressure, because now your work can shift attention, and attention in this system is a limited resource. The risks here are still indirect, but they're growing. A misinterpreted pattern can redirect an investigation. An overlooked connection can delay action. You won't see the consequences immediately, but they exist. And over time, you start to feel that weight. You also begin to notice something else. Not all information is equal. Some reports move quickly, others disappear into the system. Some names trigger immediate interest, others don't. You start to understand that intelligence isn't just about data, it's about prioritization. And prioritization is shaped by experience, judgment, and sometimes institutional bias. This realization changes how you work. You become more careful, more deliberate. You double-check your assumptions. You learn how to write reports that don't just describe information, but guide interpretation, because that's what the next level requires, the ability to take fragmented inputs and turn them into something actionable. At this stage, you're still being watched. Your reports are reviewed. Your conclusions are questioned, not because they expect you to fail, but because they're testing whether you can handle more access, more responsibility, more consequence. And if you prove that you can consistently identify what matters without overreaching, without missing critical details, you move forward. Because the next level is where your work stops being background and starts becoming direction. Level 3 isn't about noticing patterns anymore. It's about defining them. And once you reach that point, the system begins to rely on you in ways that are harder to step away from. Level 3, intelligence analyst / targeting officer. This is where your role becomes visible, at least internally. You're no longer assisting analysis. You are the analyst. Your name is attached to assessments. Your reports are no longer just inputs. They are used to make decisions. At this level, your job is to produce intelligence, not just interpret it. You take everything coming from below, raw reports, flagged anomalies, early patterns, and turn it into structured understanding. You answer questions like, who's involved? What are they doing? Where are they operating? And most importantly, what does it mean? Your work becomes part of official briefings. Operational teams read what you write. Supervisors rely on your conclusions to allocate resources. This is where accuracy becomes critical in a different way, because now your interpretation carries weight. Micro scenario, you're building a profile on a target who has avoided attention for months. Financial. Records show nothing unusual, communications are limited, but travel patterns reveal short, repeated trips to the same region. You map the timing against known incidents. The overlap isn't perfect, but it's close enough. You write the assessment. That profile becomes the justification for surveillance. At this level, you are shaping reality for the system. Not objectively, but functionally. What you highlight becomes important. What you exclude fades away. That's where the pressure intensifies. Because now, your decisions don't just influence direction, they create it. The pay reflects this responsibility, often ranging from $80,000 to $120,000 depending on experience and specialization. But the increase comes with expectations. You're expected to be right more often than you're wrong. And when you're wrong, the consequences are harder to contain. Promotion to this level typically requires years of consistent performance, advanced training, and demonstrated analytical judgment. Some analysts specialize further: counterterrorism, cyber intelligence, financial tracking. Others become targeting officers, focusing specifically on identifying individuals or networks for operational action. Targeting is more precise, more direct, and carries higher stakes because now your work doesn't just inform operations, it initiates them. The risks here become real, not physically, not yet, but operationally. A flawed assessment can lead to wasted resources, or worse, misdirected action. You may never see the outcome directly, but you'll know your work contributed to it. And that knowledge changes how you approach every decision. This is also where you start to understand something most people outside the system don't realize. Information is never complete. You are always working with gaps. Assumptions are unavoidable, and certainty is rare. But decisions still have to be made, so you learn to operate in uncertainty, to build confidence without absolute proof, to justify conclusions based on probability, not perfection. This is what separates this level from the one below. At level 2, you identified patterns. At level 3, you define what those patterns mean, and that meaning drives action. You also begin to interact more directly with operational teams. Briefings become conversations. Your assessments are questioned in real time. You defend your conclusions. You adjust them when necessary, because now the system is no longer abstract. It's responsive, and you are part of that response. If you continue upward, the next transition is the most significant so far, because you move from analyzing people to handling them. Level 4 is where intelligence becomes human, and where the risks stop being theoretical. Level 4, case officer / operations officer. This is where the system changes completely. Up to this point, you've been working with information about people. Now you work with the people themselves, you leave the distance of analysis and step into human intelligence. Human. Your role is no longer to interpret behavior, it's to influence it. As a case officer, so CIA, or operations officer / handling agent, FBI or joint task forces, your responsibility is to recruit, manage, and protect sources. These are individuals who have access to information the system cannot obtain on its own. They are not employees, they are assets. And your job is to build relationships with them that are strong enough to produce intelligence, but controlled enough to remain secure. You don't start here without preparation. Promotion to this level requires years of analytical experience, specialized training, and psychological evaluation, because the skill set changes. You're no longer rewarded for being precise. You're rewarded for being persuasive, controlled, and adaptable. Your daily work is unpredictable. Meetings in controlled environments, encrypted communications, constant awareness of surveillance, both yours and theirs. Every interaction is documented. Every decision is reviewed. Nothing is informal, even when it appears that way. You're sitting across from a source in a quiet restaurant. To anyone watching, it looks like a casual conversation, but every word is deliberate. You ask a question slightly differently than usual. They hesitate, just for a second. That hesitation tells you more than the answer itself. You adjust your approach instantly. This is where intelligence becomes personal, because sources are unpredictable. They have motivations, money, ideology, fear, coercion, and those motivations can change. Your responsibility is to manage that instability, to keep the flow of information consistent, and to recognize when something is off before it becomes a problem. The pay increases again, often between $90,000 and $140,000, depending on experience, location, and operational status. Additional incentives may exist: overseas assignments, housing allowances, hazard pay. But the compensation reflects the risk, because now the risks are no longer abstract. They are immediate. A compromised meeting, a misjudged source, a failure to detect surveillance. Any of these can end an operation instantly, or worse. And while you may not be in direct combat, You are operating in environments where the margin for error is small. The pressure at this level is constant, not because something is always happening, but because something always could. You also begin to understand a deeper layer of the system. Not all intelligence is clean, not all sources are reliable, and not all decisions are comfortable. You may work with individuals you don't trust. You may rely on information that is incomplete. You may be required to maintain relationships that exist purely for operational value. This is where the ethical dimension becomes harder to ignore. But the system doesn't stop for that. It adapts, and so do you. Advancement from this level depends on more than performance. It depends on judgment. Can you manage risk without escalating it? Can you maintain control in situations that are inherently unstable? Can you produce results without compromising the operation? Because above you, someone is responsible for multiple officers like you, and they are evaluating not just what you achieve, but how you achieve it. At this level, success is measured quietly. There are no public acknowledgments, no visible rewards, just continued access, continued responsibility, continued trust. And if you demonstrate that you can operate consistently in this environment, the next step moves you further away from the field again, but not into safety, into oversight. Level 5 is where you stop being the one taking the risk and become the one responsible for it. Level 5. Supervisory special agent / team leader / station chief. You don't gather intelligence anymore. You manage the people who do. At this level, your role shifts from execution to coordination. You oversee multiple analysts, multiple case officers, multiple operations, often at the same time. Your job is to make sure the system functions, that information flows correctly, that risks are evaluated before they become problems, and that decisions are made at the right level. You're no longer focused on a single target, you're focused on a network of activity. You review reports instead of writing them. You approve operations instead of conducting them. You intervene when something doesn't align. Micro scenario, you're reviewing an operational plan submitted by a case officer. The source looks promising, the access is real, but something in the timeline doesn't match previous behavior. It's subtle, but enough. You delay the operation. Days later, new intelligence confirms the source was compromised. That decision prevented exposure. At this level, your decisions don't just affect one outcome. They affect multiple people and multiple risks. The pay continues to increase, typically between $110,000 and $160,000 depending on seniority and assignment. Benefits expand, authority increases, but so does accountability, because now, when something goes wrong, it's not just the operator who's questioned, it's you. You approved it, you allowed it, you carry it. Promotion to this level is selective. Not everyone moves up. Technical skill alone isn't enough. You need leadership, judgment under pressure, the ability to balance competing priorities without losing control. Because this level introduces something new, conflict. Different teams want different outcomes. Different analysts interpret information differently. Different operations compete for limited resources. You are the one who decides what moves forward, and what doesn't. This is also where you encounter the mid-system reality that most people outside never see. Mid-script retention reset. But here's something most people outside the organization never realize. The system is not perfectly aligned. Information doesn't flow cleanly from bottom to top. It gets filtered, adjusted, sometimes delayed. Not because of corruption, but because every level interprets risk differently. What looks urgent to an analyst may look uncertain to a supervisor. What looks actionable to an operator may look premature to leadership. And your role is to navigate that tension, to decide when to act and when to wait. Because acting too early can be just as dangerous as acting too late. This is where experience becomes critical. You've seen enough patterns to recognize when something feels off, even if you can't immediately explain why. And you learn to trust that. Because hesitation at this level isn't weakness, it's control. But control has a cost. You are now responsible for people operating in environments you can't fully see. You rely on reports, updates, secondhand information, and yet you're the one making decisions that affect their safety. That distance creates pressure, a different kind than before, less immediate, but heavier, because now You don't just carry your own actions, you carry everyone else's. And if you continue upward, that responsibility expands again. At the highest level, you won't just manage operations, you'll define them. And at that point, the system no longer feels like something you're part of. It becomes something you control. Level 6, Senior Intelligence Service / Director. Level authority. At the top, the system becomes quiet again, not because less is happening, but because everything has already been filtered before it reaches you. You don't see raw data, you don't meet sources, you don't conduct operations, you receive conclusions, summaries, briefings designed to compress complexity into decisions. Your role is no longer to understand every detail, it's to decide what happens next. At this level, Senior Intelligence Service, Assistant Directors, Agency Leadership, you operate at the intersection of intelligence and policy. Your decisions don't affect a single operation, they affect entire programs, regions, priorities. You allocate resources, authorize missions, approve or deny actions that have already passed through every level below you. Micro scenario, you're sitting in a secure briefing room, a summary is presented, months of intelligence condensed into a few pages. The recommendation is clear, proceed with the operation. The risks are outlined, but incomplete. They always are. You ask 2 questions, you pause, then you decide. That decision sets everything in motion. At this level, certainty doesn't exist, only judgment. And the higher you go, the less information you actually see in its raw form. You rely on the system, on the layers below you, on the people who interpreted, filtered, and shaped what you're now reviewing. That's the paradox of power here. You have the most authority, but the least direct visibility. The pay reflects the position, often exceeding $160,000 to $200,000 plus, along with significant benefits, influence, and long-term career stability. But compensation becomes secondary because the weight of decisions changes. You're no longer thinking about whether something is accurate. You're thinking about consequences, political, operational, human. You also become more aware of something that isn't written in any official document. Every decision removes options. Every action closes alternative paths. And once something is set in motion at this level, it is very difficult to reverse. This is where the system reveals its final layer. Not everything can be known. Not everything can be controlled. And yet decisions still have to be made. You begin to see patterns not just in intelligence, but in outcomes. Some operations succeed quietly. Others fail in ways that are never fully explained. And sometimes the difference between the two comes down to a decision made with incomplete information. Your decision. This changes how you see the entire structure. The lower levels feel precise, structured, controlled. But from the top, you see the uncertainty that exists at every stage. You understand that every report you read has already been shaped by multiple interpretations. Every recommendation carries assumptions. Every risk assessment is, at best, an estimate. And yet the system depends on you to act as if it's enough. That's the hidden cost of reaching the top. Not the workload, not the visibility, but the responsibility of deciding when enough information is truly enough. Because once you decide, someone else carries it out. Someone else steps into that hallway. Someone else stands in front of that door. And they trust that everything leading up to that moment was built correctly, but you know better. You know how many layers exist beneath that decision, how many points of uncertainty were managed, adjusted, or accepted. And that knowledge stays with you, long after the operation is over, long after the reports are filed. Because at the top of the system, power doesn't feel like control. It feels like responsibility without certainty. And once you see it that way, you can't unsee it. You